Welcome back to Grace Abounds. We are getting at the tail end now of our series on the opioid epidemic and the church's response to this crisis in our society. We're going to talk today actually with somebody who's in the trenches and working with people who do have a problem with opioids, and that's Mr. Nick Larkin, who is the Deputy Director of Health and Human Services here in Sheboygan County, with specific oversight on behavioral health matters, which includes matters of substance abuse. So I'd like to start by welcoming you. Nick, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Vali.
When we talk about AODA counseling or AODA intervention, we're talking about some kind of substance abuse, whether it's alcohol or another drug.
Or both, correct.
If you were looking at our current population that you serve in HHS in Sheboygan County, first of all, how common is it that there's more than one drug involved if we're dealing with opioids?
Greater than 50%, perhaps approaching 75%.
And what are the most common co-uses there?
Cocaine is making a strong comeback, and as is methamphetamine.
Okay, so we're talking an upper and a downer between
Correct.
methamphetamine and heroin potentially.
That's correct.
Would these have actual concomitant use, or are they just based on availability?
They certainly are. One giving you the opioid high, but being that opium is something that makes you tired, decreases your respirations. Oftentimes we see it mixed or used concurrently with cocaine or methamphetamine or amphetamine in general to get that opioid high, but also to be able to function throughout the day.
I'm guessing here, but I'm thinking that if we're using the two together, that's not going to last very long before a person is going to require some serious medical intervention.
Correct. We sadly see a large number of overdoses as people's tolerance goes up and up with opioids, and then they perhaps run out and they have a few days of withdrawal. Their bodies adjust to it, and then they use what they typically would have used prior. Their bodies again have adjusted, and even though they've used the same amount that they previously had used a week ago, their respiratory system cannot handle it. They stop breathing, and they are unresponsive. As many overdoses as we are seeing, we are also seeing a lot of Narcan saves, which we're very happy about, and we're very glad that fire and police are carrying Narcan.
And how common is it in the opioid using population or abusing population that you're seeing a dual diagnosis with something on the mental health spectrum?
It's common, although it's not best practice to go right ahead and dually diagnose if you don't know if somebody has a history of a mental disorder. And the reason for that is because many times people can present with symptoms that mimic a mental health disorder. However, it's simply a product of their use or their withdrawal or their early withdrawal or their post-acute withdrawal symptoms.
So if I have any disease that is chronic, I might be depressed because of that, but that might not be depression in a clinical sense, is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, with cocaine and methamphetamine is probably the best example. Our clients who have been using methamphetamine or cocaine or both for quite some time, and they stop, they experience severe depressive symptoms. Whether or not that is clinical depression is yet to be seen. We like to see people be sober and in recovery, so not just not using, but also active in recovery for quite some time before our two psychiatrists would make a diagnosis of mental health.
Now, we've talked to a couple of people from the recovery community, both from the using side and from the side of working in a recovery community organization or a 12-step program. Any one of those models involves some level of community, a group, a meeting. We would hope that people suffering from any of these disorders would engage at a church, for example. If somebody's trying to get in recovery, how can a church work to try to connect with somebody like that and say that they matter and that there are people who will love them and care for them? How should a church go about that?
Sure. Well, you can't overemphasize the power of community and fellowship in recovery. So, and I think it's important to differentiate the difference between treatment and recovery. So treatment is certainly a service that one receives. It's led by a professional. There's different levels of service. There, for example, is individual therapy, all the way on up to inpatient hospitalization with various levels in between, like detox and intensive outpatient. But treatment is temporary. Treatment typically lasts anywhere from a year to 3 years. Recovery is a lifestyle, and recovery is for the rest of your life, and it is more important than treatment. Treatment often is necessary to get you in the front door of recovery. But there's nothing that beats recovery. And as far as the types of recovery programs that are out there, certainly we support all different types of recovery programs, smart recovery. But at Health and Human Services, we mostly support the 12-step program of AA and NA. So to answer your question, I think the first step would be to refer them to a professional who would be able to evaluate what level of care they need first. And the best approach, the most effective approach that we've seen in early recovery is both treatment and recovery together. Sometimes people are in such a bad physical state that they need treatment before they can really enter into any sort of recovery. So these are the individuals who are going to go through some very, very intense withdrawal. These are individuals who would need to go to a treatment center because we know and we've learned, it's not new knowledge to AODA counselors, that dealers and runners, particularly nowadays, if they have not heard from you in a few weeks, they know that you have either tried to get clean or you have found somebody cheaper, so they will seek you out and give you free stuff and say, Father Carl, I haven't heard from you for a couple weeks, here's some free stuff. Mm-hmm. Then they've got you back.
Find you on your smartphone.
Very easily so. And so because of that, a treatment facility is required. That environment is required for quite some time until somebody can begin making those life changes. Now, while they're at that treatment facility or receiving that treatment, they oftentimes go through 12-step programming. But fellowship is number one. You simply cannot do it on your own. Mm-hmm. You cannot do it on your own.
Now, you've worked in this area for quite some time, but if we were to look at just raw numbers and compare 2017 now to, say, 5 years ago, how would you make any contrast between what we're seeing in the community at the level of opioid abuse in this county?
7 years ago, Health and Human Services, we had a year end of 61 out-of-home placements for children. So that means that Child Protective Services had to go into the home and remove approximately 61 children from their parents due to either neglect, drugs, inability to care. This year we are on pace to be at about 275. The majority of those are drug related, and the majority of those that are drug related are opioid related. So many people know how it's impacted us nationwide and even statewide. In 2013, it was made public that through the CDC that the age group of 25 to 65, the leading cause of death, which had been motor vehicle accidents for decades, was surpassed by drug overdoses. We in Wisconsin are right on par with the rest of the nation. And in Sheboygan, I would argue the newest data that we're seeing from law enforcement suggests that we may be a little bit worse than some of the other counties. But I think that statistic right there of how much this is impacting parents, families, and the community is there's no more profound statistic than that, sadly. It doesn't just affect the user. Certainly affects the user. I mean, they can die, they can lose their lose their job and their family, but it affects their children. It affects the community. It affects taxpayers. The fiscal impact to take a child from the home is extremely substantial. The human impact is even greater. So we're seeing it in quite high numbers, and we're seeing the devastating effects up close and personal.
So if we take that number of children going from 61 to say 270 as at least a surrogate of the underlying level of abuse of opioids, do you have an opinion as to what might be driving that? Why are we seeing more opioid usage now than, say, 7 years ago?
There's a lot of theories and thoughts about why heroin and opioids have made this surge in the last 7 to 10 years. I personally, through my own research, and I think my colleagues would share, I think big pharma really pushing Oxycontin as and actually labeling it many years ago as actually non-addictive definitely played a role. I think that did not have this intention, but I think having patient satisfaction as part of reimbursement puts doctors in a difficult place. When
if I'm in pain, I'm not going to give you a rating that I'm satisfied.
That's right. That's right. And so, and that's not to demonize physicians, but it puts physicians in a difficult spot. I'm a registered nurse myself, and when I went through nursing school, pain was the fifth vital sign, and that. I think those factors contributed, but there's other factors that have yet to be discovered.
Just going back to your training as a nurse and the fifth vital sign of pain, full disclosure, I worked on the development of marketing plans for hydrocodone and hydromorphone products in pharma for years in the 90s. And that's when the American Pain Council, funded by a number of pharma companies, came out with how do you rate your pain things with the smiley faces
Sure.
and the crying faces and all that. Was that something you were encountering when you were being trained as a nurse?
Certainly, and it can start that way. I think that I would add that the lack of we're making progress in the area of requiring now in Wisconsin all physicians to register with the prescription drug monitoring program, whereas in the past it was not a requirement. And that I think that's going to yield big changes, because nobody wants to be, when you're surveilled and you have to register every controlled substance that you prescribe, nobody wants to be seen as the dentist or the physician or the veterinarian, for example, that prescribes the highest amount of opioids. So, but I do think that doctors have gotten a little bit of a bad rap on this issue, because though there certainly are some physicians out there that maybe have had some malpractice or whatnot with opioids. I think the majority of them are trying to do the right thing. They're they took a Hippocratic oath to do no harm. And when you see your patient in pain, and you may not understand addiction as well as somebody else, your first instinct is to prescribe them opioids.
As a professional in the AODA counseling side of things, do you make a distinction between drug dependence and drug addiction?
I make a distinction between the what was formerly referred to as drug abuse and drug dependence. And I would put addiction in line with dependence. So there are certainly people who abuse drugs, and they certainly have cravings and they want the drug. But when you've crossed the line into dependence / addiction, it's no longer just a conscious process. So for example, we oftentimes hear our patients say, I wanted to stop. I knew it was destroying my family. I knew I was going to destroy my job. I knew my little girl's face. I knew what it would look like when I came home. But before I knew it, I was already halfway on my way to my dealer's house. With MRI, brain imaging, scanning, and neurobiology, we know that when you cross that line into addiction and dependency, it's no longer impacting your frontal cortex, the part of your brain that's rational, the part that tells us stop and no, and that's mostly conscious. It affects that deepest part of our brain, the midbrain, which deals with drives, instincts, unconscious urges. It's part of the brain that most likely is involved with the phenomenon of being in a car and you slam on the brakes and you think you're going to hit a deer and you just naturally go like that to protect the person next to you. There's no thinking that takes place in that moment, and that's the difficulty for dependence and addiction, is that when you cross that line, you cannot do it on your own. In the same way that I could not put my hand out to protect my wife from going through the windshield, I would need help. I would need to set my life up such that I would have things in place that would stop me from using, even during those days where I would want to use. And there's triggers all around us. Wisconsin has so many bars, so many, alcohol and drugs. There's so many triggers out there. And when you're part of a fellowship and you have a sponsor and you have somebody that you're having to call every single day, or you're working a 12-step program, when you go to the wedding, that's going to have a lot of alcohol. Or you go to Summerfest where there might be some drugs in the air, you're probably going to go with somebody else who's sober. You're probably going to go and tell the group that you're with, I can't use anything. Stop me. That's where the fellowship really comes in and really helps.
Okay, so let's come back to some solutions, in effect, or strategies to enhance recovery. As a church, or as people of faith, or as individual believers, obviously we can reach somebody at that rational cognitive part of the brain with words. We can argue with them. We can tell them about faith. We can tell them about hope. We can tell them we love them. We can try to demonstrate that. But if we're also trying to interrupt something that's not at a cognitive level, what can a church really do to reach somebody?
One of the things that I would recommend is a strategy by Carl Rogers, and that's unconditional positive regard. You want people to know, as you use the word love, that you truly do love them. People use the word love with drugs, but in the way that I define love, people don't really love drugs in the same way that they love their children. It can appear that way, and the brain can kind of be tricked into thinking that. But what I would encourage members of faith and members of the community who are trying to motivate individuals to change is to draw upon those things that they still love. For example, their children, or their friends, or their family, or their wives. Typically, people still have a love for that. That those are usually the last things to go, and to share with them, not the gloom and doom of, this is where your life can go if you continue to use and you don't seek help. That's been slammed down their throat, and they've also already experienced it, probably. What they probably haven't heard much of is hope. They haven't heard much of I can actually get my family back. I can get my job back. I can be part of community again. I can redeem. I can make amends. So focusing on the positive aspects of recovery. Sometimes we have a misconception that getting into recovery is all about hitting rock bottom. That's used a lot. And certainly that is a huge motivator of getting people into recovery and treatment. But what keeps people in treatment, in my mind, and keeps people sober and keeps people engaged in recovery is not the negative. It's the positive. So the people who go to NA and AA and stand up and have 10 years and truly have 10 years of sobriety, they still are concerned and worried that if they go back and they have another drink that their life could fall apart. But they're more so staying in it because they like the way they feel. They like the way their life is. They're happy with who they are. And they have begun to differentiate between the pleasure that the drug gave them and the happiness that they now feel. Most people who are going to be coming to you or who come to us, if they want to experience pleasure, they know how to do it. They can buy it for a cheap price and they can experience pleasure throughout the whole day. But they can't be happy, and they know they're not happy. They know at the end of the day when they look themselves in the mirror that they're unhappy. They know that their daughter doesn't want to talk to them. They know that they've hurt a lot of people. So hope, happiness, and love is really the main message in motivating people.
Well, thank you for ending us on that hopeful message. Love, hope, and happiness. As you know, in a church perspective, we not only believe but preach that there is always hope, and that God's love for us is unconditional, even when we really mess up. And that as a church, we are equipped to be God's arms to reach out to those who have messed up. Stay with us as we discuss more how we're going to weave this whole series back together into the gospel message of redemption, into the gospel message of new life. Thank you for being with us again, and God bless.